So one of the interesting things about Iranian history is just how different the Qajar and Safavid dynasties were from each other. Um, Specifically, the Safavid dynasty was very centralized and very bureaucratic. The emperor's authority was absolute. The country was run by his bureaucrats. The army answered to him. The populace answered to him. It very much was absolutism. The local landowners didn't have as much influence as they did in, say, Europe at the time. Like, I believe Iran was more comparable to, the Ottomans or China in that time. A very centralized, one might even, or a very powerful monarchy with a very high degree of control over the country, that was able to build institutions outside of or more outside of the influence of the aristocracy than in other countries. But this stands in stark contrast to the Qajar dynasty, which was dominated by the tribes of Iran. Many don't know, but Iran has historically, or especially with Turkic and Kurdish and Arab migrations, has accrued a lot of tribes, although in modern times, these tribes have mostly settled down. But back in the really ever since the Seljuk dynasty in the medieval era, and especially after the Mongol Empire, Iran had a large tribal population of mainly Turkic tribes that settled in Iran, but also there were Kurdish tribes and some Arab tribes. And for example, there exists a significant Azeri Turkish or Azerbaijani Turkish speaking minority in Iran, concentrated in the country's northwest, and they were very politically influential throughout history. So anyway, the Qajar dynasty Iran, the military was dominated by the tribal leaders. In fact, the tribes of Iran, especially the most powerful tribal confederacy, that being the Bakhtiaris, they had a much better military than the Qajar central government. The military was actually more modernized, and it could call upon a reliable pool of levies. In fact, the Qajar central government's army was mostly composed, or at least its most reliable core, were tribal levies. And the only reason really that the Qajars weren't overthrown by the tribes is because they purposefully incited divisions within those tribes and between those tribes. And so in a lot of the tribes, you had perpetual border conflicts or internal or civil wars. And they also created tribal confederacies, specifically such as the Khamza, to counter other tribal confederacies, right? The Khamza were created to counter the very powerful Bakhtiari confederacy, and the Khamza were just a grouping together of Kurdish, Arab, and Turkic tribes who couldn't trace back to one ancestor, but nevertheless, the confederacy was established and succeeded in counterbalancing the Bakhtiaris. And additionally, the Qajar Iran was very decentralized. The government did not collect taxes. They practiced tax farming, which is when you sell the rights to collect taxes to another person, and I believe, or you auction it off. They get a cut of the taxes, and you can get the taxes. Problem is that usually these tax collectors, this was the problem observed in the Ottoman Empire specific, and I believe in other governments that practice tax farming, such as the Roman Republic. A common problem with tax farming is simply that the tax farmers, the people who bought the right to tax, will just tax as much as possible within their time frame, so they can extract as much profit as possible. And this usually leads to the peasantry being mistreated, a lot of corruption, a lot of abuse over taxation, and it led to tons of revolts, right? The Ottoman Empire, one of the reasons why there was so many revolts in the 1700s and 1800s was partially because of tax farming, which caused constant revolts from corruption and especially overtaxation and just a lack of long-term development, as all the money was being funneled into Constantinople. And so the Qajars suffered from the same problem. Additionally, the clergy or ulama of Iran had grown much more independent. They had accrued land and financial resources, and even had specifically the Khums tax diverted to them. And this had been present during Safavid times, but the collapse of the Safavids and the following essentially warlord era, you could call it, where a bunch of states like or I guess like rump states were all fighting each other to succeed the Safavids, and some of them were able to rise to the occasion but crumbled really quickly. And so during this time, the ulama were able to further their independence, and the Qajars depended on them for legitimacy, and as a result were kind of forced to patronize them, or otherwise they would have to fight a very difficult clergy-led insurgency, which would not have been pleasant. So the Qajars were weak on like all directions, in terms of the military, in terms of administration, and in terms of religion, with the tribes, the aristocracy, and or tax farmers, and the provincial administrations, and the clergy all being very autonomous from the central government. But again, this stands in stark contrast to Safavid times. So in Safavid times, the central government controlled the army and was the undisputed authority. It appointed numerous bureaucrats. It had like a solid bureaucratic structure, where the Qajars basically didn't even have really a central bureaucracy. It was very informal, with the government depending on local aristocracy and tax farmers and the courtiers, and the government tried to establish ministries in the late 1800s, but these ministries didn't even have any real like permanent employees really, other than maybe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of War. But the other ministries were ministries were bureaus without a bureaucracy. That was a good description that I liked of them. Again, in stark contrast to Safavid times. So the question is, why were the Safavids so centralized and bureaucratic and militarily, professional like basically every way? How was the Safavid Shah so powerful, but the Qajar Shah was so weak that he had to depend on making groups fight each other, so that they would have to turn to him to arbitration? And it appears that there are two main factors. Number one is trade, because interestingly enough, the Safavids started in a very similar position to the Qajars. The Safavids had established themselves through Shia Turkic warriors who had dominated the politics and the army, and to a lesser extent the administration of the nascent Safavid state. And the Safavids were very decentralized, informal when they had first unified Iran. And this continued into Shah Abbas. I believe he's called Abbas the Great. He was able to rout the enemies of the Safavids, those being the Ottomans and the rising or the powerful like Uzbek Khanate in modern Uzbekistan. And he was the one who set about these centralizing reforms. And he was able to do this because of the revenues from the silk trade, especially in the northern Iranian province of Mazandaran, I believe it's called Mazandaran. There are a lot of silk is produced, and at this time Iran was gaining a lot of revenue from that trade. I believe especially because trade was mainly came into the purview of the central government, as is the case for most states throughout history, I believe. And the Shah Abbas was able to use this money to create his own central army and lessen his dependence on the tribal Turkic warriors who weren't necessarily loyal to him. Additionally, to counterbalance, to further limit the influence of these Turkic tribal warriors, he recruited slaves from the Caucasus and made them soldiers, right? These were mainly Circassians and Georgians, but I believe Armenians may have also been among them. But mainly Circassians and Georgians, I believe. And this created a new elite corps within Abbas's army, which drastically lessened the influence of the Turkic tribal warriors. He was ruthless. He assassinated his main political opponents or opponent, and very much established himself as the dominant, unopposable authority, and established Persian-style bureaucracy, and relocated the capital from Tabriz to Isfahan. But by the by the time of the Qajars, trade had declined since Iran had gone through a long period of warfare and division, right? The prosperity that was present during Safavid times. In fact, I believe I read somewhere that the Safavid dynasty during the 1600s may have had the highest standard of living out of anywhere in the world, and that was how prosperous Safavid Persia was. Even if the borders aren't, even if like the Safavid dynasty didn't really extend all that much beyond Iran and Afghanistan, and had like smaller borders in comparison to other Persian dynasties such as the Sassanids or even the Achaemenids, they were still very prosperous during their zenith. But this prosperity had lessened by the time of the Qajars, and additionally, trade had been rerouted with the discovery and colonization of the Americas. Now, it's not like as soon as the Americas were discovered, by Christopher Columbus, that immediately trade started to shift. It took quite a while, but I believe trade with the New World really picked off in the later 1500s and especially in the 1600s. Previously, it mainly commerce in the New World mainly consisted of Spain exploiting the mineral resources, especially silver and gold. But as it became more and more colonized, as the New World became more developed and more populations migrated there, with the establishment of the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese colonies, and also slavery being used as cheap labor to set up industries in the New World. By the 1700s, the New World was very much a significant market, a producer and consumer of goods, even if the population density was still very low. Trade had risen massively in the 1700s and had rerouted the commerce that had previously gone through the Middle East. And this was a big problem for, the Ottoman and Safavid empires, and also had ramifications for the Qajars. And also this was one of the reasons for the Ottoman dynasty's decline. Less trade was passing through them due to the discovery of the New World and the Europeans getting richer and establishing colonies throughout the Indian Ocean and Indonesia and adjacent to China, and all of the trade was being routed through the Indian Ocean instead of going through the Middle East like it used to. And that really lessened revenues for the Ottomans and also for the Qajars. And because Qajars were losing revenue, and also because they didn't have access to Caucasian slaves after they lost the Caucasus to Russia in the 1800s, they couldn't rely on slaves to build an army, and they didn't have the money to do that either. And European merchants or European powers were trying to penetrate Iran, especially the British and Russians. They were trying to penetrate Iran in the 1800s, and were increasing their influence, and were extracting a number of concessions, and even were able to set up, were able to get monopolies on, finance and even the right to build infrastructure in some regions. Essentially, they were able to extract a lot of concessions with the Iranian government, which prevented domestic Iranian industries from rising, and also Iranian merchants had become more and more outcompeted by British and Russian, manufacturers who could manufacture more efficiently with, the Industrial Revolution. Iran was going through like a trade deficit, which fueled inflation, which again made things even harder. And the Qajar dynasty was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy due to falling revenues, trade deficit, and also because they were just really lavish. Even when the Qajar state was essentially bankrupt, the Qajar family was still very lavish and spent massive amounts to get basically whatever thing they fancied. And so that's why the Qajars were so much less decentralized than the Safavids. They didn't have the money, and they didn't have the slaves. It's interesting to think about how changes in what might seem to be like, insignificant minor changes in material conditions can actually have a huge impact on the politics of a country and also in like the society of it, in this kind of butterfly effect, right? The discovery of the New World caused Iran of all places to decentralize and then slide into decline and not really catch up until, well, the rise of Reza Shah, really. So yeah, I just find it really interesting.